Hi there, I'm Paul Colby, and this is the Debate Clinic channel, and this is the first of what I think will be a number of updates throughout the year on issues relating to the arms sales topic for you policy debaters. You know very well, as we have mentioned in the summer camp and as other advisors have certainly told you, you need to keep your evidence up to date, and at least you need to keep up with the news that is relevant to whatever your affirmative case is or whatever positions you have to defend when you're on the negative. So this is an opportunity to look at some of what's going on since the summer when you gathered a lot of your evidence. And if you're just starting to gather your evidence and to take a look at the topic, this will bring you up to speed on what has been going on lately. What I want to do is talk about some of the affirmatives that are out there and the evidence that you had from the summer and what has happened since, and some suggestions on what you do with what you've learned from the current events. I'm not going to tell you what evidence you should be using. I'm going to suggest that you look some things up, but I'm also going to suggest just some argumentation that flows from what has happened in recent weeks or months. So, let's take, for example, Saudi Arabia affirmatives. These tend to deal with the abuse of human rights by the Saudi government over many years, and especially over recent years and months. All right? So, what you have on the affirmative is the proposition that the United States cannot be a partner to the abuse that is part and parcel of the government of Saudi Arabia, human rights abuse. What has come up lately that is worth noting is that there have been some reflections on why we might need to be aligned with Saudi Arabia even though they are bad boys. Okay? So, for example, we have recent attacks on oil refining facilities and oil production facilities in Saudi Arabia that made the stock market jittery for a few days. What is the point here? First of all, if you're on the negative, you say, or you can say, all of a sudden people realize that 5% of the world's supply of fossil fuels is endangered or is offline. Okay, that's a strong negative argument if it turns out to be true. But if you're on the affirmative, you will also say, well, there was a brief bubble here in the United States when that 5% was in question. Okay, but then there was quickly a price adjustment or a cost adjustment so that American consumers hardly noticed anything after a week or two. All right? There was no real gigantic swing in the market cost-wise for fossil fuels because of what happened there. So then you take it a little bit further. You say, what about the anti-missile defenses that we have been providing to Saudi Arabia? Well, they don't seem to have had any effect on what happened there. In other words, even with American-supplied missile defenses, the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia were quite vulnerable. So, what is the point of selling them these armaments? Okay, on the other hand, what did Donald Trump say we wanted to do? Send in troops. Troops is different than arms. If troops were a solution, and I'm not saying that they are a solution, but if troops were what we needed to send in rather than more armaments, then that's irrelevant to the sale of arms from the United States to Saudi Arabia. What this really comes down to is another issue around inherency and solvency with respect to sales to Saudi Arabia, because as we have pointed out before in your raw evidence file that most of you have access to, or should, okay, or you should have access to it, the Trump administration decided to just kiss off the protestations from Congress about American involvement in a Saudi-Yemeni civil encounter. And so they just said, well, let's go ahead and do it. And if you look at the very most recent news, you will see, reported on CNN just the other night, I mean November 5 when I say the other night, that arms are secretly being moved into the theater there, despite the fact that Congress wanted to stop all sales of arms to Saudi Arabia. So, that's what I'm saying. You need to bring your evidence up to date to reflect what's happened lately. Let's take Israel, the other violator of human rights. In Israel, you have plenty of arguments about what they're doing to the Palestinians, etc. Now, one reason those arguments have some inherent basis is because of the Bibi Netanyahu government's stance with respect to Palestine. Because there have been, if you do not know, in the past, and it's relatively distant now, there were actually peaceful Israeli governments that were more interested in coming to some sort of reckoning with the Palestinians instead of just assaulting them. But Bibi did not survive the election in good shape in Israel recently. In fact, he had a problem forming a government, and in fact, there is a question of where things go from here. Now, first thing you could argue, depending on what side you're on, does it make any difference? Do the opponents that Netanyahu faced in his election challenge have some different worldview, significantly different is what we're trying to say, than he does? And if not, then what difference does it make that he didn't form a government right away, etc., etc.? But it really comes down to a question about the Palestinians and the Israelis. And one thing I noted in recent debate rounds, I have often told you, go ahead and if you can argue a position without having to use evidence, that's fine with me, as long as you know what you're talking about. But in a recent round that I judged, there was a team on the negative suggesting that the Palestinians had no real interest in the lands which are their lands, and then an affirmative team responding with an equally nonsensical argument. In other words, both of them were wrong about the basic history of Israel-Palestine and what lands Israel now occupies that used to be Palestinian territory. What I have said before is that you need to look at something like the CIA's World Book, which gives you capsule descriptions of governments and their geography and their territorial situation, their historical positions on political affairs vis-a-vis their neighbors and so forth. It's always useful to have a background so that if you say something without citing an evidence card, you're saying something that you can actually assume the judge also knows. In this case, I had two teams arguing silly statements that weren't true, that sort of canceled each other out because neither one knew exactly what they were really saying. We have talked before about going to Wikipedia to get a basic knowledge about some global situations. You don't go to Wikipedia, for example, to quote Wikipedia, but you can go to Wikipedia if you want a quick, condensed version of what's going on someplace, and then you can use that condensed version because there are tons of footnotes in most Wikipedia articles, all right? So you don't quote Wikipedia, but you can go to the footnotes if you need support for any point that you make. But usually it's just a question of familiarizing yourself with what is going on somewhere in some part of the world, okay? Or on some issue, or about some topic that you don't really know about. So don't ignore Wikipedia. Don't ignore anything that brings you up to speed, like the CIA's World Book, that gives you a background so that you can argue questions, especially in cross-examination, as I have often argued. Let's talk about Taiwan. There are lots of Taiwan affirmatives, and they talk about how American arms sales are destabilizing because they irritate the Chinese who think Taiwan is part of China. All right. Importantly, teams seem to be ignoring the fact that we actually did now finally commence, ratify, begin the $8 billion arms sales of F-16 fighter jets to Taiwan. So we did that in August. So the question is, has anything happened since then, since August, to destabilize the situation between the United States and China? Arguments can be made on both sides, but that's what you should be looking for when you're looking at the news. I would also say, and have said since the summer, that there is a parallel situation between developments in Taiwan and developments in Hong Kong, because both of these are cases where the Chinese hegemony and the Chinese desire to maintain their kind of order and their kind of political affiliation or dynamic comes head to head with some potential public protests. And in the case of Hong Kong, that's been going on for months. So I think you can legitimately draw some parallels between Taiwan and Hong Kong if you want, but you should certainly know that we did finally sell them jets in August. Let's take a look at Ukraine. This is definitely a strong subject at the moment because it involves the potential impeachment of Donald Trump for doing bad boy things in talking about Ukrainian arms sales and promoting a shadow foreign policy in the background. Now, we have heard a lot lately about $391 million in arms that has been put on hold briefly unless Ukraine decided to do Donald Trump's bidding. What most people don't seem to be recognizing as particularly relevant to this topic is the fact that $250 million of that 391 million number is Pentagon sales, and 141 million is State Department sales. We have talked at the summer camp, and I have mentioned it on your Raw Evidence platform, the distinction between foreign military sales and direct commercial sales. This is an exact platform to discuss this, because there are two different kinds of supported and authorized by Congress aid going to Ukraine. All right? 250 and 141 million comes out to 391 million. Are you going to do something with that argument? You can if you look it up. And if you look up where the authority lies and whether the president has the authority to cancel the sales, which he did anyway, which leads to a very broad discussion about Trump's policy of selling American. He calls it buy American, but we're really talking about selling American. You can't be advocating that the U.S. wants no part of endless wars and at the same time is still the largest arms merchant in the whole globe and probably in all of history. But you know, whatever you want to say about that, we're still the big boys, and we are still providing weapons that mean that hot spots all over the earth are well-armed hot spots on both sides. Okay, but think about it this way. In numerous cases, especially in the Saudi case, for example, Saudis versus Yemen, the Congress has stood up and said, you can't do that anymore. And Trump has said, yes, I can, and yes, I will. So, on the one hand, you have a strong inherency argument about arms sales policy going in one direction as long as Trump is running the government. But on the other hand, you have an issue with solvency. All right? I know many teams these days, and many college teams as well as high school teams, pay scant attention to inherency. They simply state, this is what is, not why it is, but this is what is, and this is what we're changing. But if you have a policy, for example, a Donald Trump policy about selling arms, that is inherently a policy that you have to change, you have a solvency problem if you can't actually stop Donald Trump from doing something that's against the law in the first place. Do you see what I mean? You can't control somebody who doesn't obey the law. So always keep in mind this balance between inherency and solvency. You have to walk a tightrope when you are arguing for inherency and at the same time saying that you can solve a problem. All right? And I'm not telling you how to do that. I'm telling you that if you have a judge like me, you have to do it because I do pay attention to inherency, although some don't, and in that case you don't have to worry about it.